Hey everyone, thanks for coming to the August 2022 Filecoin Green Meetup. We're gonna wait a few minutes for people to filter in and for people to tune in on YouTube. This is being live streamed and recorded at the same time, so if you want to come back and check anything out later, it should be on the Filecoin YouTube channel. And if you are in Zoom and you want to introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from, feel free to do that. Sounds in the chat like everywhere that people are calling in from is unseasonably warm, which we should probably do something about that and cool the planet down. All right, let's get started. Hi, my name is Alan from Filecoin Green. Thanks for coming to our August meetup, or streaming it on YouTube. We have a couple great speakers lined up today. So let's get started. It does sound from the chat like everywhere people are calling in from is warmer than it's supposed to be. So we should probably stop emitting so much CO2 and figure out ways to track the CO2 that people are emitting and reduce it. So here's the agenda that we're going through today over the next hour or so. First, I'm going to give a welcome and intro. As I said, my name is Alan Ransel, team lead for Filecoin Green. Then Oreen Iodele from our team is going to talk about the SBS hackathon and just give a pretty quick recap of what happened at the Sustainable Blockchain Summit hackathon that we put on about 3 weeks ago, I guess was the finale, something like that. Then we're going to hear from JM, the hackathon winner, who wrote this amazing project called EcoSoul, which uses NFTs to track the green score for Filecoin storage spreaders. Then we're going to hear from Wes Geisenberger from the Hbar Foundation about the Guardian, which is their integrated system for tracking sustainability information, and how that ties in with what we're doing. So the Sustainable Blockchain Summit, you can get more information at sbs.tech. We just had a version of this in July in Paris. It was pretty amazing. We had speakers from a bunch of different networks and with expertise in a bunch of different areas. On the top left, you see a panel we had on decarbonizing the power grid and the role of Web3 in doing that. In the middle, over to the sort of right here, you have Alex Paris from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, talking about we have a choice, either collective action or collective suicide. Pretty intense stuff. On the upper right here, you have Orion talking about the hackathon. You have a panel here on the role of different crypto networks in decarbonizing. And we heard from Gregory Landua over on the right. He gave a great closing keynote. And then on the left here, we had a huge panel workshop on different tokenized carbon offset projects, and talked through a bunch of the benefits and challenges people are facing in that space. So if you want more information on this, and especially on that tokenized carbon roundtable, you can go to Protocol Labs GitHub page. You can go to SBS EU. It's a public repository where you can see both the notes from the tokenized carbon roundtable. Caitlin from our team put a lot of effort into taking all those notes and polishing them all up. This conversation was done using Chatham House rules, so people are not associated with their comments, so no one's name is in there because it was anonymous. But there's some good stuff that people were talking about that you can find in those notes. You can also see in that repository what we're doing to decarbonize travel to the Sustainable Blockchain Summit, and there's going to be more information on that soon. You can also check out the Filecoin YouTube channel, which you may be using to stream this right now. There are playlists that have every talk that happened at the Sustainable Blockchain Summit. There are four different tracks, so 2 different rooms on 2 different days, which have recordings of all the talks. So please, go check those out. And then the last thing I wanted to cover was we are doing another one right near DevCon. So this is going to be the Sustainable Blockchain Summit in Latin America on October 12th in Bogota, Colombia. So if you're coming to DevCon, or if you had another reason to come to Bogota, please come and check out the next rendition of the Sustainable Blockchain Summit. There are also, if you go to sbs.tech, in about a day or so, that website is going to be updated with more information on the Bogota event. You'll also be able to apply in order to either speak or sponsor at the event. Those applications are going to be open for about 3 weeks until the end of this month, until the end of August. And then in early September, we're going to release the agenda for that event. So I wanted to turn it over to Orion to give an overview of the hackathon we ran.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alan. So this was our first hackathon with the Filecoin Green team, and we had some great partners for this hackathon. We partnered with Gitcoin, Chainlink, Fluence, and Hedera, and we were looking for hackers, developers, anyone who wanted to build on our Filecoin Green tools, and seeking those who really want to transform tomorrow's verifiably sustainable web. And so this hackathon was very much focused on learning how to make the environmental impacts of projects more transparent. And some of the challenge statements and base statements that we had focused on the best implementation of a protocol on their sustainability project. And we had 250 plus participants from around the world involved. We had great sessions with Juan Bennett, the founder of Protocol Labs. We had speakers from Fluence. We had AMAs and what is Filecoin Green, and 70 projects were submitted, and project ideas included a community hub for Filecoin storage providers to track their green reputation score, locating and understanding the distribution of green storage providers across the world in the Filecoin network, indoor vertical farms, and data tracker. And this is our first of many hackathons, and you will be able to hear more from our partner Hedera and our hackathon winner that we all love at Filecoin Green and wider Protocol Labs. So yeah, I will now pass it on to Ecosoul so he can talk about the project that we all loved at Filecoin Green.
Awesome, cool. Hey, how's it going? I will share about the project that I built for the Sustainable Blockchain Hackathon. As Lorraine said, huge shout out to the team for organizing this. It was a really fun experience. Yeah, let me just go ahead and share my screen. Oh, maybe that's not the right screen. Maybe it's this one. Cool. All right, yeah. So let me share the project that I built. Yeah, so what I built for the Sustainable Blockchain Hackathon, this project's name was called Ecosoul. It is a community hub for Filecoin storage providers centered around a community NFT that holds sort of a green score that I calculated that involves, off-chain statistics that I got from the Filecoin Green API. I'll elaborate more on what exactly that is. But first, let me provide some context on sort of how I got to building this and why I felt it was important to build this. So one of the reasons that I got inspired to hack at this hackathon was by a slide or a talk that I saw online by Juan that involved him showing this diagram, which said, Filecoin, Green wants to make the world, the planet the greenest possible. In order to make a green planet, you need to have green industries like green crypto industry. But to make an industry like crypto green, you need to have, the most important part of the protocol, the network's green. In order to have the network's green, you need to have a network as widely used as Filecoin to be as green as possible. And obviously, one of the most energy intensive parts of the Filecoin stack is the energy consumed by the storage providers to help the network going. So you need to have green storage providers. So in my mind, what was sort of an insurmountable problem of like, how do you make the planet green was kind of shrunk down into a more tractable problem of sort of, is there a way we can make storage providers as green as possible? And so that was sort of the mission or the problem statement that I wanted to tackle for this hackathon as an individual developer and see what I could sort of hack around there. When it comes to sort of incentivizing people to do something, I like to think there's broadly sort of two very effective ways to doing it. One is sort of financial incentive, obviously, can you subsidize people to do a certain action or move people towards certain action? And then there's also sort of the status incentive where, can you construct sort of a value hierarchy in which people are measured and then hope that they, optimize their actions or move and behave towards sort of going up the ladder of that hierarchy. And because I'm not a crypto whale or anything, with a lot of money to throw around and incentivize people to, be more green, I try to construct the ladder structure, basically creating sort of an honor system by which we have storage providers be measured their green score of how sustainable their operations is, and then create sort of a leaderboard, and by doing so hope that storage providers are optimize their operations such that they can be more green than they are now, such that our whole network, Filecoin network, is more green than before. So what that exactly involved, so there are three main components of my project. One was how do you calculate a green score or a green reputation score, to be specific, of each Filecoin storage providers based on some data that the APIs shared from Filecoin Green. And then I created a community NFT that kind of holds those scores on chain. And I can talk about the implications of that in a second. And finally, I deployed a sort of web app to not only claim that NFT, but as I said, have a leaderboard that shows exactly like which Filecoin storage provider is more green than the other based on those scores. Yeah, so let me quickly talk about sort of why a green reputation score and how that sort of manifested eventually. My sort of goal and objective when it came to the score was trying to make it as simple as possible. So think of, can we, quantify and summarize the sustainability of the operations of a Filecoin storage provider in a single digit between like 0 to 10. And, can we use that to basically at a glance see which storage providers are more green than the other, such that, in one snapshot, we can, easily see and quantify that measure. And I will go over, what metrics were exactly involved in the score. There were three sort of broad categories. The first was a renewable energy ratio score. The second was an accounting granularity score. And the third was a grid carbon intensity score. I'll walk through each of the scores and how I sort of came to calculate each of the metrics involved. So the first is the renewable energy ratio score. This is sort of probably the most straightforward score. It's basically trying to answer the question of, in your history of operation as a Filecoin storage provider, what percentage of the energy you consumed came from renewable sources? And I use sort of Filecoin Green's APIs to calculate this value. I probably don't have to further elaborate on like why that's important, because basically we want to measure like which storage providers have net zero emissions, if not negative emissions, and this is sort of a direct measurement of that. How this was calculated was just taking the total amount of renewable energy from the renewable energy certificates purchased by the storage providers, whether that was already delivered or yet to be delivered, and then just divide that by the total cumulative energy from their operations. And I used sort of these three endpoints to get those metrics. And then after doing those calculations, I obtained a positive number, ended up ranging between 0 and infinity. And I can elaborate on why that was the case. So, why I was between 0 and infinity and whether that was fair is because basically there were certain storage providers that were consuming very little energy, meaning they were actually storing very little on the network, but for some reason purchasing a good amount of renewable energy, which made their score super skewed, because you can imagine, if you divide a somewhat of a large value by a very minuscule or small value, if not somewhere near 0, the value would be near, in the hundreds or infinitely large. So that was an issue. So you got storage providers who are actually contributing a lot to the network, but have a much smaller score than those who are contributing little to nothing to the network. And basically, I need to find a way to kind of make that a little more fair. So, as I said here, smaller cumulative energy led to a really high ratio. So I basically thought, what if we could weight this score in a way that's a little more fair? This part is a little more hand wavy and kind of, it's what I thought was fair, but obviously there are, further implications of doing this and probably could be done in a better way. But what I ended up doing was, taking the score and saying, if you have, a score between 0 and 1, and the ratio here, when the ratio is 1, it basically means the storage provider has net zero emissions. I said you should be getting a score of 9 out of 10, which is kind of like 90% out of 100, which is a good score, because being net zero emissions is great. And then basically, any the score between 0 and 1 would just be linearly scaled between 0 and 9, but any score beyond 1 would basically be scaled logarithmically, such that you have sort of diminishing returns after your scores go higher, in order to be fair to those who have like scores in the hundreds, such that we don't unfairly reward those storage providers. Basically, at the end of the day, you normalize that and find a value between 0 and 10 that represents how much of your consumed energy was renewable by the REX purchase. So that was sort of the renewable energy ratio score. That was score number 1. The second score is the accounting granularity score. This is kind of answering the question of how closely does the renewable energy you've purchased through the REX match the energy you've consumed. This is kind of inspired by the scope 2 guidance, which basically said, for your electricity consumption, when you're trying to offset those with the REX you've purchased should be issued and redeemed as close as possible to both the period and the location of the electricity consumption. And this is, to my understanding, kind of what's guiding one of the phases of Filecoin Green's objectives, which is, offering shorter accounting periods on the REX that you can purchase. And basically the TLDR here, and it is kind of borrowing an analogy that Alan used to explain this to me, is like, we don't want Filecoin storage providers to, batch purchase REX, as in, you could consume energy throughout the entire year and then purchase one REC at the end of the year that offsets the entire consumption of the year. That would be like, kind of splurge eating at the end of, the year. We want you to actually snack on REX throughout the year, such that, whenever you consume a bit of energy, maybe it's on a monthly basis or like a weekly basis, ideally even shorter, so we can account exactly which renewable energy offsets which consumption, but snack on REX throughout the year in much shorter time intervals, such that, you have more granular tracking of that data. So that's kind of the context behind what the accounting granularity score attempts to calculate. How that sort of actually manifested is I basically, got all the data of the REX from the Filecoin Green API. And in the REX, it has sort of a start start date and an end date in terms of reporting time. So in order to find the accounting period, I took the start date and end date and found the difference, which is just like a time length of the accounting period, which right now could range from as short as like a month to as long as a year, if not, multiple months, etc. And that I sort of took all of that as, a storage provider's Rex sort of accounting periods, and you can imagine there's like an array of that. And then I calculated a weight for each of the periods such that we reward shorter periods. So you can imagine like if you're a month, you get 0.3. If you're a year, you get 0.6, something like that. And basically, found all these weights at which we could sort of weight these periods. And then I found sort of the weighted sum of for each storage provider. You take all their accounting periods that are, resulting from each rec they've purchased, and then you weight it in a way that rewards shorter periods, because we said we want shorter periods, more accurate reflection of the offsets. And then you find a weighted sum, and then I just normalized that between 0 and 10, just like the previous score. And then you got sort of a score that kind of summarized, between 0 and 10, how granularly have you been accounting your renewable energy purchases. Yeah, and that was sort of the accounting granularity score. And then finally, you have the sort of grid carbon intensity score, which is also a pretty straightforward measure. It's basically answering, what marginal emissions rate at which your power grid operates. And basically, the inspiration behind this was like, as much as we want to just purchase RECs and offset your energy consumption, we also want to be able to exhaust all the possible options to kind of minimize the net emissions. And one of the important parts of consuming energy is like what's the emissions rate of the power grid at which you source your actual electricity. And so this is kind of like measuring that rate at which the power grid operates. How I was able to calculate this was sort of using estimates of like where basically there was an API called watt time, where if you feed a coordinate, it will give you sort of this emissions rate, which is called the MOER score. It's just like marginal operation emissions rate. And so there was another API called GIMPIX API that gives you kind of the estimate location of storage providers. So I just took the locations, fed it into the watt time API, got the score, and sort of used that score. I inverted it such that if it's higher rate, if it's lower rate, we reward that with the higher score. So it was just kind of normalize that between 0 and 10, and then inverted and got that score. So long story short, I took a bunch of these scores, and then I wanted to, again, aggregate that into a single summary score. So I took all the scores, weighted them in ways that I thought was fair, depending on the availability of the data, what I thought was more significant. For instance, I thought the renewable energy ratio was the most significant measure. I weighted the 3 scores like that, found the weighted sum, and said that was sort of the green reputation score. Now, that was a kind of long elaboration of how I came to calculate that score, but you can imagine like, the big question is, okay, you've calculated this score, you have this metric for every storage provider, what do you do with the score? And that's sort of what also I wanted to experiment with this project for the hackathon. So I'm going to do a bit of a live demo here. If you give me a second, I believe I shared my screen for the slideshow, but I'm going to quickly share my actual screen so I can show you the Chrome browser, in which I have my kind of deployed project. Yeah. Oh, maybe it was the same. Okay, anyway, so this was sort of my presentation, but yeah, the live demo. So what I basically built was I deployed a project at a domain called ecosol.xyz. Here on the landing page, you see a nice spinning earth, which is like cool. But you'll be able to basically connect your wallet. It's like a little dApp. Obviously, I'm using sort of the EVM stack that I'm comfortable with here, but it could be a more eco-friendly stack. And then you could connect your wallet here, claim your NFT, go to a leaderboard. Let's quickly go to this leaderboard and see what that's all about. Here we sort of have a real-time leaderboard of Filecoin storage providers, as I sort of hinted at earlier, based on the green scores that I've calculated. So you can imagine like this board is currently sorted by the overall score of the reputation score, in descending order. And so you can see like, miner ID is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, has like a really high score. And you can imagine my understanding is like this miner is like associated with Filecoin Green, so that kind of makes sense. If not, they're like collaborating with it. But if you're kind of skeptical, you can also go over to the sort of Zero Labs website and actually check whether or not this miner, 01234, actually is someone that's purchasing a lot of REX and doing that in a short accounting period. And indeed, you can see like this individual miner, has very short accounting periods, snacks on REX regularly, and has bought a lot of REX. So it's like, indeed, that's true that they deserve a high score. Anyway, so you have a leaderboard, that shows all the miners, storage providers who are relevant to the network who have purchased REX and sort of sorted their scores in a descending manner. You can also sort of filter by the different individual scores. So I said, there's renewable ratio score, there's accounting granularity score, et cetera, et cetera. And so at a single glance, you can sort of see by which measures one storage provider is more sustainable than another. And then you can also filter by regions. So you can check out, all these different regions, in Asia, in China, I guess North Beijing, we could see all these, storage providers, and the regions in optimized or not optimized, I guess, sorted by their accounting score, such like this. So I built like a leaderboard based on the scores such that you can sort them and see at a glance snapshot which storage providers are more green than another. And, this is interesting because you can imagine, Filecoin Plus users being able to sort of look at this and be like, I want to store my data with the most green storage provider possible. And this is a easy way for them to see which one and select which storage provider to store their data with, which is pretty neat. And that's sort of the leaderboard. But now I wanted to share you sort of the community NFT aspect, which is kind of the central part of this project. So if you go back to the homepage, or you just go to the claim NFT sort of screen. If I was, let's imagine, a storage provider and I wanted to claim my community NFT, I could come here and put my storage provider ID. And so imagine my storage provider ID is like 08383, for instance. I'll first verify my identity, and that's simply signing a message with the sort of worker address associated with your storage provider ID. And so I would like copy this and then, get the signature. I've disabled this for the expediency of this demo. So imagine, I have a, signature here. I'd paste that, it would verify the identity. Once you do that, you're allowed to claim your NFT. And so I could go ahead and claim my NFT. If it works. 1 second. Okay, sad. It worked like 10 minutes ago. Oh no, okay. I tested this 10 minutes ago and I forgot that, this is a soulbound token. You can't have more than one token in your wallet. So anyway, maybe it's easier that I go over to, let's imagine that I actually signed the signature and claim my token. It's actually better that we skip this because we'd have to wait to Etherscan to actually scan the block on the testnet and then wait for that. But let's imagine, I do indeed claim my community NFT. Then I'll be able to sort of see on OpenSea what that looks like. And basically, if I were to mint it, and I minted this literally like a couple minutes ago, if you go to the contract, the token ID on the testnet, oops, oh, so this is the metadata associated with the NFT. But if you go to, for instance, Etherscan, like 45 minutes, I had minted this token. It's the EcoSoul token to this address that's associated, connected to my wallet here. And so basically, yeah, once you assume we successfully minted the NFT, we can go to, any marketplace that indexes the chain and sort of look at our NFT. And what that looks like here is like, I'd have my storage provider ID here, and then I'd have my region here. And you can see, my rank of how green I am out of all the storage providers in the leaderboard. And so it's like 447, pretty good rank. And then here's like a metric of each of the scores that I calculated, that are on the NFT. ideally real-time updating as dynamic NFT. They're also shared here as attributes on a JSON, as shown here, associated with my actual NFT. And so here you see all the different scores associated with this NFT, and the values are actually on chain as a JSON. So yeah, that's sort of the actual community NFT, and this is a soulbound token that, you know, it's a non-transferable token associated with the wallet that you mint this NFT to. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You know, that's sort of the community NFT aspect of all this. And you know, you can imagine every storage provider claiming this NFT to share with their friends and family and sort of show off how green you are, you know, in the grand scheme of all the storage providers in the network, and a way to kind of have your scores on chain. So let me quickly, you know, wrap up by showing sort of what are the implications of that, and why that is important. And hopefully you can still see my screen. Oh, first of all, I'm going to go over sort of what part of that involved IPFS and Filecoin. Basically, all the NFT metadata, as you saw, is hosted on IPFS via an SDK called Pinata. And this whole web app that I just showed you is also hosted on IPFS as well via the service called Fleek. And then all the green score metrics that I used to calculate all the scores were based on Filecoin Green API. So it was an interesting experiment of using, you know, a full stack of Filecoin or Filecoin Green APIs and SDKs, and building something for the Filecoin community, which is, you know, to incentivize the community to be more green and sustainable than it is now. And so why is this important? I thought this was an interesting project because you can imagine, like, you know, these scores are bound to an NFT. You know, why is that important? Obviously, it's like visually stimulating and exciting, but also the fact that the scores are on chain means that, you know, the NFT data can actually be taken outside of this project and this sort of dApp that I've created. And for instance, some examples of that, you know, maybe other projects can find these measures useful. For instance, if I'm like a sustainability DAO and I want to, you know, create a new DAO and launch a new DAO and extend invitations, I can actually go and check, you know, from this contract, who are the most green miners based on the aggregate score, and maybe extend an invitation to them based on the fact that they're like, you know, someone that cares about sustainability. Or if I'm like another green protocol, you know, you can imagine like, you know, a Klima DAO type protocol, you know, that wants to launch a token. Maybe you want to, you know, airdrop rewards to the top green miners. So that might be why you're interested in these scores. You know, finally, you can also just, you know, crowdsource useful insights, the fact that these scores are on chain, and people can use various analytical tools to see, you know, what kind of interesting data analytics you can do on this. On top of that, you know, there's actually a really interesting way of using this NFT as sort of credentials to legitimize actors in a sort of ESG-driven network. And this is kind of a broader extension of what a community NFT could do for some sort of network. And so as a thought experiment, I kind of thought about what could you do? You know, Wes is going to talk about this in a second, but, you know, if we were to do something like this on a Hbar network, you know, kind of a proof of legitimacy for on-chain actors, what would that look like? So, you know, one use case is like, you know, you have this dynamic NFT that shows credentials for these actors. You know, imagine you're in a market that has carbon offsets and RECs. You know, you could actually have better improved identity management on top of that network. And in a more concrete way, you know, let's say you're a carbon credit buyer and you want to purchase carbons that are high quality, you know, to offset the emissions you're having on your project. And you can imagine, you know, currently, you know, there's a service called Guardian on Hedera that, you know, allows you to issue ESG asset tokens, and in a verifiable manner that's all on chain. And you can verify, you know, with a methodology and the history of the asset, for instance. But, you know, that's a lot of information for a, you know, an individual buyer to consume and analyze and understand. So maybe there's an NFT representation that summarizes all that data into a single, you know, NFT or, you know, metric that basically says this is how legitimate this issuer is, and provides a better sort of user experience to buyers. Another thing that, you know, I'm actually interested and currently actively kind of looking into is sort of, you know, actually involving Hedera and Guardian to, you know, take the storage providers and their sustainability scores and help them just offset using Hedera assets, you know, on their network using Guardian. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be involved in the Hedera network. Sort of final thoughts, you know, I think there's obviously, not to go into too much detail since I've gone over it, but overall, this project was a cool experimentation, and in a certain direction you could take things regarding calculating a green score for storage providers and what to do with that. But, you know, better data, you know, would have been nice. Obviously, it was like a 2-week hackathon project, so I was, hacking through a lot of this and making kind of cutting corners and making interesting sort of decisions on estimates and hand wavy ways. More mathematically rigorous ways of actually doing the calculation and having better data pipelines. For instance, the Wattime API didn't have data for all of Asia, and that was like a big issue because, as you saw, there's a lot of Asia, China storage providers. So I think if I were to do this again, better data pipelining and sort of a more mathematically rigorous way to calculate would have improved the project. But anyway, long story short, that was my project. And thanks for tuning in. Shout out to all these folks, Mocha, Alan, Mark, Oreen, Jamie, and Jenks and Gloria for hosting this project. And I had a really fun time and hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It's so good. Thank you for walking us through, all the different pieces of this. If anyone has a question, about this project specifically, now is a good time to ask that. I have a question about, so you talked a little bit about the 3 different pieces of the score, right? The renewable score, and then you combine them by adding them. Do you have thoughts on combining them by adding them versus multiplying them, how that sort of changes the incentive structure?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, and actually something that Alan and I talked about briefly. Basically, again, to repeat the question, it's I can actually go back to the slide. Maybe it'll take too long, but what I did after I calculated those sort of 3 broad measures was kind of take this kind of hand wavy weighted sum by calculating the weights of each score and then adding them. A suggestion here was, can you actually just take these scores that I've calculated, score 1, 2, 3, and multiply them to find an aggregate score that would also sort of be, given that a lot of these score dimensions are, these score values are dimensionless, you could multiply them and have a sort of larger score based on that. That's actually the first way I've calculated this score. And I think what ended up happening was, and I think I did this before I normalized some of these scores, but it was kind of overinflating some of the scores in that it was incentivizing those small storage providers to have much larger scores. And at the end of the day, the scores ended up, when I multiplied them, becoming in the larger value range, and it was kind of not obvious what was more. It was not obviously a score before I normalized it that was easily visible in a single view to compare one score from another. But I think more importantly, knowing that sort of these 2 scores, the accounting granularity score and sort of the carbon grid intensity score, the latter score, the intensity score, had a lot of missing values. So for instance, it was missing all the Asia values that I said from the Wattime API. So I just kind of used the mean data from other regions to assign to that. So I felt like this score was just a weaker, more less accurate measure. And then the accounting granularity score, I felt was, because these recs have not been around for long, there's only data from 2020, and a lot of this data, there was also some issues with the accuracy of some of the reporting periods that I had to manually finagle to make sure it actually works. So I think it was, from my confidence of knowing exactly how legitimate the data was, I kind of wanted to weight the renewable energy ratio higher because it was, of the 3 scores I've calculated, probably the most accurate because it was coming straight from the, Zero Labs Filecoin Green API, and it was a lot more granular. So basically, I could have gone with the multiplication, but I felt it was overinflating scores in which I had, less confidence about based on the quality of the data and the amount of data I had. So I ended up sort of using this weighted, estimation to calculate. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Both pieces of that, right? Is you need to be able to weight them because each of these sort of sources of information isn't equal, and you sort of lose the ability to do that unless you add them. And then also, yeah, I get what you're saying, that there's a lot of value in being able to look at a score and understand what it means, and it's easier to do that, right? If you sort of normalize and then add with these weights, rather than if you multiply them. It gets harder when you're staring at the leaderboard to kind of conceptualize what you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Also, I'm not monitoring YouTube. I know there are there's some people watching there. Could go back and see if people have questions there afterwards. All right, thank you so much, Jam. That the project really blew us all away, and we're it's great to see how you conceptualize this, right, in terms of like the big picture and the crypto economic incentives, and then like how you built out sort of each element of that, right, like the score itself, and then how you actually like translate that into leaderboard, and then how you use these like sold out NFTs to allow people to prove their credentials. So awesome job.
Thanks so much.
Next, we have Wes from Hpar Foundation.
Hey, everyone. And I just want to say a big thank you to Filecoin and Protocol Labs team. So I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, today, as kind of Alan and Jam alluded to, we'll talk a little bit about the Guardian. And can y'all see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So as part of kind of the Hbar ecosystem, we have a key fund which is the Hbar Foundation. And the Hbar Foundation has 4 sub funds within it, which one of them was the first major fund in sustainability from a layer 1 in crypto. It's called the Hbar Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund. As part of that fund, we've taken our investments and really targeted things like carbon emissions tracking, creating different ESG assets on Hedera, and that can go into many different areas, but a lot of times it's very simply looking at the supply and demand sides of the market, where we're investing in creating these assets with full auditability, discoverability of the assets and the data, kind of like Jam was looking into, and looking at the different granularity scores, but making all of that data available on Ledger, knowing how roles and actors participate to make that data, following auditable methodologies, whether it's creating carbon emission tied to a traditional supply chain or something related to the technology provider, or understanding the roles and actors with creating something like a carbon offset or a renewable energy credit. We've done tons of different grants out there. We have a few highlights here on the screen, just talking about some of the key ones of recent, including folks like Timeless, who's live tracking carbon emissions tied in with the Australian government, or folks like Crypsy, who have announced their carbon core platforms working in the Middle East with a group called Amano, one of the largest rooftop solar companies out of Dubai. And we can go on, but there's a large list who are all doing very similar things in creating both supply and demand tied to different stakeholders in the market. And what they're doing on Hedera specifically is they're using the different services of Hedera that are looking at tracking information. So we have, as a public layer 1 network, Hedera has these 3 services: the consensus service, the token service, and the smart contract service. And you can think of really the consensus service as that service that I can get an auditable log of information, such as a decentralized identifier or verifiable credential. And that's actually where our W3C DID method lives, or a native token of our token service, which is the equivalent of Hbar, our native cryptocurrency, where we can say, I can create an in-state token on our network, meaning that it's not creating a new smart contract that manages the balance of that token, but it actually lives natively in a wallet. And you don't need to have an extra audit. You can rely on the audits of the Hedera network. But on top of that, we actually have an EVM compatible smart contract service, which allows you to still get the programmability features with those tokens, but not have to make the security sacrifices or the throughput sacrifices that come with smart contracts. And the Guardian actually uses a bunch of these services to create auditable, trusted assets, ESG assets on Hedera, using things like decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials that map from methodologies or policies to different signatures or identities that could represent devices, systems, or people. So a good example could be a Filecoin storage provider could use the Guardian to put an identifier on every single cluster that they have, if they wanted to track emissions down to a very granular level. Or they could just leave it at a meter level, having identifiers, understanding consumption on specific environments they have, and they could mint carbon emissions tokens representative of those different storage providers, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And what the Guardian is really good at is allowing that relationship to exist between the policies or methodologies of carbon emissions to the specific roles and actors and the auditable outcomes they create in data, which amounts to additional tokens on a network that follows standards. And at Hedera and at the Hbar Foundation, we're very interested in these standards because it's what forms the base layer for things like interoperability. It forms the base layer for how we understand what in fact is a renewable energy credit, what in fact is a carbon offset, or what exactly as a metric ton of scope 2 emissions equate to. And on Hdera, we hold those in wallets, just like you would in another network. But what's really unique is we're actually making investments in Hdera in new types of trading mechanisms where we can actually track and buy things like renewable energy credits or carbon credits to the individual unique metric ton because of the throughput capabilities of Hdera. And on Hdera, we can handle tens of thousands of transactions a second as a public ledger. And we can facilitate different types of trading because of that. So even our smart contract service can handle both non-fungible and fungible tokens encumbered into the smart contracts or traded within smart contracts as liquidity pools for specific assets. And so as part of this, what we really look to do is take advantage of our services working together to achieve these auditable outcomes. Now, just taking a step back of Hdera, the network, just so you have a sense of what we can do from a throughput perspective, we can do tens of thousands of transactions a second for a fraction of a penny with finality in a few seconds and an extremely low energy usage on a per transaction basis compared to other networks. And as part of that, we're focused on using these primitives to enable a high throughput market that can handle data coming in very short intervals. So talking about those bite-sized intervals, taking very short data intervals so we can create tokens that represent carbon emissions down to things like 15-minute periods. So we can even do 15-minute matching on things like RECs to emissions. And the idea is we also don't have to pay a ton of money to do so. We can do this fairly. So our markets can run fairly based on how the transactions are submitted, the unique timestamps of when these tokens are created, transferred or traded, and getting a unique order on that timestamp to a specific token or to a specific transaction that's being logged on Hdera. Now, all this underpins the Guardian, which is a service, you can think of it as a digital measurement, reporting, and verification tool that enables that auditability for any type of ESG actor to build a workflow that can be very sophisticated. It could represent an entire IT environment with sub-metering on it. It could represent an entire supply chain for a manufacturing process. And the idea is we're able to map every single process to the scope 1, 2, and 3 methodologies for things like greenhouse gas protocol, or any other type of carbon emission standard, or on the flip side of the market, any renewable energy credit standard. And we'll talk about some of those specific examples in a minute. But the idea is when we create these assets, they're stored immutably on the ledger. You can transfer and trade them depending on what type of asset they are, or whether they may be soul-bound. Maybe you don't want to transfer them and trade them. And we actually use Filecoin to help underpin the storage of these verifiable credentials that are used in the workflows, which we'll walk through in a couple minutes here. And as we look to scale up and get to more high throughput use cases, we'll go from things like NFT.storage or services like NFT.storage to Web3.storage. And we're very much looking forward to the coming state of things like CO2.storage, which I know our community is very excited about. And the actors in our community for the Guardian are kind of spread far and wide. They're not just folks who are building methodologies, but they're folks who are building marketplaces that interact with those tokens coming from application issuers. And a lot of them are really excited about a specific workflow that starts from a sensor or a manual attestation level that generates measurable, reportable, and verifiable information that the Guardian observes. And the Guardian really isn't meant to manage state. It's an open source piece of code or technology that is just making sure that those transactions are following a set of rules and taxonomies, so that when a token is minted, we can go check what methodology that they're following and understand, does that actor, have the right, does it fulfill a role within the methodology to create some form of data that fits within the logic that creates a token. And as part of that, generally when we mint a claim or a token, we want to be able to prove every step along the way so that when we go to retire that asset, we know that that token is fully auditable. There's different signing events that led up to it, that each party is trusted or can build a reputation over time to create a fully auditable life cycle from when the project has started from an application to a registry all the way to the point of retirement. And what really we're looking to do as part of this is defining different root authorities or standard registry outcomes where they can say, I have an identifier, and it doesn't have to be a Vera, a gold standard, or an IREC, but someone could stand up and say, hey, I want to create a new process, a more thorough registry. And I want to be able to issue credentials to all my verifiers or validation verification bodies who each have their own identifiers in themselves. And what you can ultimately do is you can build a chain of trust, which actually exists in the real world today with a lot of these registry programs where they actually have a system of delegated authority to basically certify folks to go check that project, make sure that they're doing a proper baseline, make sure they're calculating correctly, following the different rules and standards that you're trained on, that we've certified you on. And they can then go and issue credentials to other parties or devices that can then be used to collect information. And those other parties can be individuals or third-party companies. And so on the Guardian, we took that process and we said, well, these different decentralized identifiers, by linking them together with chains of credentials, we could ultimately get that same level of trust, but in a fully digitized manner, so that when we produce a data point from whether it's a sensor or a manual attestation, it can follow this whole workflow that we can track to the point where we're linking the rules or the rule setters to the roles and actors, like a verifier, to even devices. And these chains can get very long. They can be 10 to 15 links long in the chain. But when that data is produced, it fits within an order of information where you can have logic tied to the policy. And that's what the Guardian really is all about, is linking any type of data, whether it's manually collected, sensor-based, to that policy to get to an auditable outcome in the market. And so very simply on Hedera, what that looks like is a series of consensus service messages, which you can think of as a message queue of information of decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials that lead to a tokenization event on either side of the market. And we have some really good examples. So JM talked a little bit about one in Dovu, and Dovu's actually doing this on the carbon offset side of the market. So you would generally use that for offsetting things like scope 1 or scope 3 emissions. And what Dovu is looking at is helping farmers and coaching them to capture more carbon within a soil-based methodology. And what they're doing is they're coaching the farmers to improve their farming practices. And by improving those farming practices, it will capture additional carbon within the soil and look at the depletion rate as a way to measure additionality. So setting a baseline and then improving it from there. And they actually reward the farmers based on continuous improvement over time. And that information is stored following a methodology on Hedera using the Guardian. And what Dovu is doing is minting what they call a dynamic NFT, but a unique metric ton with a link to a topic on Hedera, which has that information with an audit log on the consensus service, which they then sell in their marketplace. And you can actually go to Dovu's marketplace today, and you can buy metric tons of carbon. I will say they're quite high because they've been selling out recently, but they've been doing a good job of bringing these different assets to market that folks can buy to offset their carbon footprint. On the flip side, we also have folks like Temua, who are taking a totally different process of verified emission reduction, where they're also creating offsets, but they're doing it from a viewpoint of the tea industry, where they're actually reducing emissions in places where you traditionally burn wood, and using alternative biofuels to do so, and actually avoiding methane emissions by turning what normally would produce a significant amount of methane, which is byproduct from the sugarcane industry, into briquettes that burn instead of a highly polluting wood product, which is traditionally used in the Kenyan tea industry, which is very large. On the flip side of the market, we have folks like Avery Dennison, who are tracking large supply chains. And for folks who don't know about Avery Dennison, if you check the back of your shirt and you see this triangle label, that is the company we're talking about here. They're one of the world's largest label and digital ID manufacturers. They're actually the world's largest RFID manufacturer. And what they're looking to do is actually assign a unique digital identifier using the Guardian to track carbon emissions on both scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for specific supply chains. And they're very excited about being able to help their customers track carbon footprints of very specific products, so they can assign, with veracity, the exact kilogram or metric tonnage per item, and be able to share that not with their customers, but also their supply chain stakeholders, so that not just their products, but their customers' products can have that level of traceability. And this all fits in a much larger market. And as we think about it from a fund perspective, we're actively investing in all sorts of different areas across the market, where the Guardian is really the solution, which is the trust layer for auditability. And that looks a lot like, tracking RECs. It looks a lot like tracking carbon emissions using the Guardian, but it interfaces with a whole system, a whole series of different applications that are building a refi ecosystem or a sustainability market on Hedera. And so we really encourage everyone to reach out. We're super excited about how to integrate with the Guardian, use Filecoin as part of that. And for folks who want to engage further, there's different opportunities of getting started from a technical perspective, the Guardian repo. There's also, different documentation out there, as well as how-to guides and demo tutorials on Envision Blockchain's YouTube page. And if you're interested in applying for funding and adopting the Guardian or other Hedera-based technologies, please feel free to reach out to hbarfoundation.org/apply. And for those who are interested in on where to find the Guardian, again, github.com/hashgraph/Guardian. And it's out there, with a lot of folks actively contributing to it, but it's very easy to go through, and we have some good documentation here for folks to engage with. Yeah, thank you all for the time today, and happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Wes. Thanks for walking through all of that. Like the whole system that you're building with the Guardian is, really fantastic, right? Where you can really see like you're putting sort of all the pieces of the story together, right? As to like why we can do a better job using Web3 native tools in terms of throughput, in terms of verifiability, in terms of granularity, than we can using existing tools. I had a question sort of about that. You talked about how because of this model using verifiable credentials at sort of every step of the process, and so you understand like the provenance of these claims, and like every claim in this whole chain is signed, so like who is saying what and what exactly where this information is coming from. And you talked about how that allows you to audit claims, right, in a way that is difficult or impossible otherwise. So the word audit, right, like means a specific thing in this case, right? And then the word audit also means a very specific thing in the context of financial reporting, and then it means a different but specific thing in the context of CO2 reporting or like emissions accounting, and then it means a different and specific thing in the context of like sustainability information for individual products, right? So like how do you see like the tools that you're building kind of interfacing with like the auditing that companies are doing using like the greenhouse gas protocol and sort of like not Web3 native methods, right? What does that like interface look like, and how is that going to evolve over time?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thanks, Alan, for kind of breaking that down, because I think that's a very difficult topic to kind of divide and tackle. So with the Guardian, it's really that digital measurement reporting and verification tool. So the first thing we do with the Guardian is really digitize the methodologies so anyone can understand them. And the second thing is we break down the roles and actors and the data that they're supposed to produce. So we have it in a place where multiple different parties are traditionally keeping this data separate, and we're making it available or referenceable, tied to the outcome that they're attesting to. So a lot of times credentials are a system of attestations. And so what we're doing is we're bringing that system of attestations out into a transparent layer so that someone like an auditor, whether it's a traditional climate auditor, whether it's a financial auditor, they can pick that up and say, well, this isn't following the rules. This clearly didn't get to the breadth and depth of how you're supposed to measure scope 2 or scope 3. You're missing maybe your procurement or marketing data. And that's very easy to see now, right? Instead of saying, well, it's in a different silo, it's in a different silo, and you have to chase it. So first off, making this information available is one of the key values that the Guardian brings to the table. Second piece is you now know the attestations that are coming from different actors. So there's a big issue in kind of the climate and sustainability world around validation and verification and being able to scale it. So on the supply side of the market, with under say a registry like Vera, there's only 27 validation and verification bodies. And so how do you enable 27 organizations to audit every potential climate project in the world? It's not very easy. And so in that case, taking this and scaling it even for the partners from a CDP perspective, which for emission reporting is also not very easy. So if we can enable folks to bring their own identities to the table and build reputations over time, that's one of the key problems we're looking to solve with the Guardian, is building a system that actually scales using Web3 and some of the economic primitives. To do so is one of our goals. We're not going to solve a verification from a compliance perspective, because that's not a technology problem as much as a people and government regulations problem, or voluntary market quasi regulations problem. But the thing that we can do is we can make it much easier to make that information available, and we can make it much more transparent. So when there's a gap between, say, the financier of a project or the validation and verification body and, say, the registry, we can make all this information super clear, super transparent, and easily represented, kind of with the sunshine of putting it on a public ledger. Our goal, our end-all be-all goal, is to put the balance sheet of the planet on the public ledger, and that's what the Guardian aims to do.
Awesome. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So it's like, so when you use sort of the word auditing in this context, like you are able to establish these chains, these sort of chains of provenance of information, but that doesn't replace necessarily like the financial, like the auditing that is required by like the existing system that shows up on ESG reports, but it does, potentially offload a lot of that effort and make it like much easier to produce those types of reports.
Yeah. One of our goals is when you open a CDP next time from a reporting perspective, that you see a link to your Guardian token balance, Guardian produced token balances. Doesn't say the word Guardian, doesn't say DLT. It's just here's the link to the token balance of your offsets, your emissions, and any other ESG related assets on the table. And you can see your own, your own corporate, personal, or country level balance sheet. And I think that would be a really, really cool outcome to be able to actually show that we're doing the work first on mitigation and reduction, and then on offsetting where we can.
Awesome. Really cool. Thank you for joining us for the hackathon and for SBS and for talking to us about your work.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, and just big congrats again to JM and Mincy, and it's fantastic projects as well with EcoSol, and we really appreciate all hosting it and look forward to collaborating again soon.
Good stuff. I know you have a meeting that started like a minute ago, so feel free to run to that. We're gonna hang out here for a bit, and if people have questions or thoughts, feel free to unmute. Feel free to turn on your mic. I think we're also going to turn off the live stream to YouTube and the recording, and just chat.